In the frozen winter of Boise, Idaho, an old mechanic named Walter Miller and his loyal German shepherd, Buddy, were left behind by everyone they once called family. Their house, gone. Their savings, spent. Their hope, fading like breath in the cold air. One stormy night, guided only by the dog's instincts, Walter stumbled upon an abandoned rail yard and a hidden spring of warm, steaming water beneath the ice. What began as a desperate search for shelter soon revealed something far greater, a healing force that would draw the broken, the sick, and the forgotten from miles away. But was this spring a gift of nature or a miracle from God Himself? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in miracles, hit subscribe, because tomorrow, another story of faith and redemption awaits you. Snow fell like broken glass over Boise, Idaho, cutting through the night air with a silence that stung more than sound. The wind howled down the empty streets, carrying the scent of rust and pine. And somewhere beneath that frozen chorus, a lone truck groaned its way up a hill. Inside sat Walter Miller, 72 years old, a retired mechanic whose hands still bore the stains of a life spent fixing things everyone else had already given up on. His beard was gray and wiry, his hair thin at the crown but thick at the sides, and his face had the rough-hewn look of a man who had wrestled with metal and weather all his life. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, a reminder of the factory explosion in '89 that nearly blinded him, and a limp in his right leg from an accident nobody ever paid compensation for. Walter's eyes, pale blue like the frozen river nearby, looked not at the road, but through it, as though he could already see the ending of a life he hadn't meant to outlive. Beside him on the torn vinyl seat sat Buddy, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a coat once golden and proud, now streaked with white like ash brushed over embers. His ears stood high despite the cold, his dark eyes intelligent, watchful, and fiercely loyal. He had been Walter's shadow since the day Walter rescued him from a scrapyard 6 years earlier. The day after Walter's youngest son told him over the phone that nursing homes are better equipped than you are. Buddy had been abandoned, too. Maybe that's why they understood each other without words. The truck rattled into a dead-end street near the Boise front, its headlights cutting across a row of skeletal trees. Walter parked and killed the engine. The silence that followed was the kind that pressed against the chest. Heavy, absolute. He sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, the heat of his palms fading into the cold leather. "Guess this is home now, boy," he muttered, voice rough with exhaustion. The truck's heater had long stopped working. His breath came out in mist. Buddy whined softly, leaning closer, his head resting against Walter's arm. The old man's chest tightened, not from the cold, but from the ache of knowing that this dog, this creature of instinct and heart, was the only soul left that looked at him with trust. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the creased property notice he'd been carrying for weeks. "Miller Rail Storage, Plot 9B, east of the freight line," it read. The signature at the bottom was his father's, a man who had once worked those rails until his lungs gave out. It wasn't much, just an old warehouse that had somehow never been sold, forgotten by the banks the way Walter had been forgotten by his children. He drove again, slowly, following the directions scribbled on the back of the notice. The tires groaned against snow-packed gravel until a large shadow rose from the whiteness, a rectangular structure of collapsed wood and rusted tin. The warehouse leaned like a drunk against the wind, its windows punched out, its roof sagging under decades of snow. Walter stared at it, both relieved and heartbroken. "Well, Dad," he said quietly. You left me a coffin with walls. Buddy jumped out first, landing softly, immediately circling the truck, tail low but alert. His breath steamed as he sniffed the air. Walter took his flashlight and limped toward the warped door. Inside, the space was colder than the outside, smelling of iron and mold. His beam swept over piles of railroad equipment, old gears, wrenches, bolts, ghosts of his past trades scattered like memories. He smiled bitterly. Looks like you knew I'd need a workshop, old man. He set down a worn backpack, pulled out 2 cans of soup, and lit a small camping stove. The blue flame hissed, reflecting in Buddy's eyes. The dog settled near the heat, paws tucked under, his ears still twitching at every groan of the structure. Walter ate in silence, the taste of tin and salt on his tongue, then leaned back against a crate. The pain in his joints pulsed like a second heartbeat. He glanced at Buddy. You ever think about how we ended up together? 2 strays, just trying to outlast the cold? The dog tilted his head, and Walter laughed softly. Yeah, me neither. Outside, the blizzard gathered strength. Snow slammed against the tin roof, each gust threatening to peel it away. Walter stood, wincing as his knee popped. He began stacking crates against the gaps where wind howled through. Buddy followed, nudging smaller debris toward him, as though helping. Smart dog, Walter said, a flicker of warmth in his tone. Smarter than my kids, anyway. By midnight, he had carved out a makeshift corner shielded from the wind. He spread an old tarp and laid his sleeping bag on top. Buddy curled beside him, pressing his body close to share heat. The faint glow of the stove flickered over the walls, painting them in trembling amber light. Walter's gaze drifted upward, tracing the rafters. Somewhere above, snow sifted through a gap and landed on his cheek, a cold reminder that even roofs can't keep everything out. He thought of his eldest, Tom, clean-shaven, successful, too busy to visit. Dad, you can't fix everything, Tom had said before the foreclosure. Some things are just broken. But Walter had always believed the opposite, that everything could be repaired with enough time, patience, and the right wrench. Maybe that belief had kept him alive too long. Maybe that was the curse of men who fix things. They never stop trying, even when the world has moved on. He closed his eyes. Memories came like static. The hum of the garage, the laughter of kids in the back seat of a car he'd just repaired, the faint smell of his late wife's apple pie cooling on a window he could never afford to replace. The weight of years pressed down, and for the first time, he whispered a confession not even Buddy had heard. I don't know if I can start over again. Buddy lifted his head, licking the man's hand as if in answer. There was something grounding in that touch, primal, unconditional. Walter chuckled through the ache in his chest. You're right. No use whining. He looked toward the dark rafters, where a broken sign still hung by one nail. The faded words read, Miller and Son Repair. It must have been his father's handiwork. The irony wasn't lost on him. The son had left, but the name remained. Outside, the storm began to quiet. The moon broke through the clouds, silvering the ruined tracks and the frozen hills beyond. Walter rose and limped to the doorway, opening it just enough to breathe the night. The wind bit his face, but the stars above the Boise front shone like scattered sparks, fierce and enduring. Buddy stood beside him, tail waving slowly. Together they looked out over the white world, 2 silhouettes framed by ruin. Guess it's just us now, Walter murmured. If the world closes its doors. We'll build our own." The dog gave a low, approving rumble, and somewhere in that sound was the beginning of hope. Quiet, stubborn, and alive. The morning after the storm was a cruel joke of light and ice. The snow that blanketed the Boise rail yard gleamed like crushed glass, each shard catching the weak sun and flinging it back at the man who stared from the doorway of the old warehouse. Walter Miller rubbed his hands together, his fingers swollen and stiff with arthritis, the skin cracked like old leather. He had slept little. Every creak of timber, every shifting gust of wind had set his nerves on edge. At 72, he had learned that silence was never truly silent. There was always something waiting behind it. Beside him, Buddy, his 9-year-old German shepherd, sat alert, his fur thick and dusted with frost, ears pricked toward the horizon as though guarding the whole valley. The dog's breath plumed white in the air, rhythmic and calm, a steady pulse against the chaos of the cold. Buddy had always been a dog of habit, wake, patrol, watch, and Walter had come to rely on those routines more than he admitted. When the truck battery had died during the night, Walter had cursed the world, his children, and himself for still believing it owed him something. Now he just stood there, staring at the tracks that snaked behind the warehouse, half buried beneath snow and rust. "Come on, boy," he muttered, slinging his worn satchel over one shoulder. "Let's see what kind of hell this place has left to offer." Buddy trotted ahead, paws crunching in the crusted snow. Walter followed slowly, his limp pronounced from the cold biting into his right knee. The tracks led them past twisted metal beams and shattered rail cars, relics of a time when the world had needed men like him. Men who could fix things instead of signing contracts to replace them. He stopped by a collapsed fence where a weathered sign still hung. Property of Union Rail Authority, maintenance access only. The letters were nearly gone, ghosted by decades of wind. Buddy paused there, nose working furiously, tail flicking. Then, without warning, he darted toward a mound of snow piled against a concrete wall. "Buddy, leave it!" But the dog ignored him, digging with feverish precision. Walter sighed, his breath fogging. He trudged closer, cursing under his breath until he saw what the animal had uncovered, a rusted metal hatch half hidden beneath the drift. The circular handle was fused with ice, but Buddy kept pawing, whining low. "You think there's something down there?" Walter muttered, kneeling. He touched the metal, surprised at the faint warmth radiating through his glove. That didn't make sense. Nothing in this frozen graveyard should feel warm. He pried at the hatch with a crowbar scavenged from the warehouse. The ice cracked, the hinge groaned, and a breath of air rose from below. Not cold, but damp and heavy with the smell of minerals and rusted stone. Steam curled upward like the sigh of something ancient. Walter leaned back, blinking. Well, I'll be damned. The opening revealed a narrow stairwell, concrete slick with moisture. He hesitated, the weight of age and caution anchoring him to the threshold. But Buddy descended without fear, paws echoing softly. "You lead the way, then," Walter murmured, following. Each step hummed faintly underfoot, as if the mountain itself were alive. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a small maintenance chamber, walls lined with corroded pipes and broken gauges. A trickle of water ran along the floor, warm enough to steam in the cold air. Walter knelt, dipping his fingers into it. The heat surprised him. Not scalding, but alive, pulsing faintly like blood. "Geothermal," he muttered, recalling a documentary he'd once half-watched while dozing in his armchair. The warmth spread through his hand, dulling the ache in his knuckles. When he pulled back, the fingers flexed easier than they had in years. Buddy sniffed along the walls, tail wagging. The dog stopped beside a wooden door at the far end, half buried under rubble. Walter approached carefully, shining his flashlight. The handle gave with a groan, revealing a storage room untouched by decades. Inside were wooden crates, bundles of tools wrapped in oilcloth, and, on a metal workbench, a small leather notebook blackened by time. Walter brushed away the dust and opened it. The first page bore the neat handwriting of someone named Harlan Ricks, dated 1953, Rail Supervisor, Boise Junction. Harlan Ricks had been, from what the brief notes revealed, a man of quiet obsession. He'd recorded mechanical repairs, weather changes, even the moods of workers. And near the back, in ink still legible, a single line caught Walter's breath. Discovered natural hot water vein beneath Rail Tunnel 3. Seems to ease joint pain. Testing continues. Walter's pulse quickened. His father had once spoken of a foreman who vanished after the line's closure. Some say the old man found gold underground, his father had laughed. Others said he went mad chasing steam. Maybe this was what he'd meant. He rolled up his sleeve and plunged both hands into the trickling water that flowed across the floor. The sensation was immediate, like warmth seeping into the marrow, melting pain that had become part of him. For years, his joints had swollen like rusted bolts. Now they felt loose, alive. He flexed his fingers, almost afraid to believe it. Buddy watched him closely, ears forward, tail giving a cautious wag. Walter laughed, a hoarse, broken sound that startled even himself. "You see that, boy? Damn miracle." The dog barked once, sharp and pleased, then dipped his muzzle into the stream, drinking deeply. When he lifted his head, the whites around his eyes seemed clearer, his coat gleaming in the lamplight. Walter sat there for a long time, the old notebook resting in his lap. He read the final entry again. Warmth heals what cold destroys. The earth gives back what time takes. He didn't know whether Harlan Ricks had written poetry or madness, but the words felt true. The warmth below his palms, the rhythmic drip of water, the soft panting of the only companion who hadn't left. Everything conspired to whisper the same thing. Start over. He explored further, finding stacked lumber, boxes of nails, and long-cooled lanterns, remnants of men who'd built their lives underground. As he brushed dust from a crate, something caught his eye. A faded photograph pinned beneath a rusted nail. It showed a group of railway workers, grinning in their grease-stained uniforms. One man stood out, a tall figure with the same hawkish nose Walter saw in his own mirror. His grandfather, Samuel Miller, back when he'd still believed work could build a future. Walter stared at the photo until his vision blurred. The generations pressed down on him like the weight of the mountain above. He'd spent his life fixing broken engines. Maybe now, for the first time, it was his turn to fix himself. He returned to the surface with Buddy, steam trailing from their clothes. The world outside was still winter, still cruel, but something had shifted. The ache in his body had dulled, and a faint sense of purpose stirred where despair had lived. He looked at the rising sun bleeding through the cloud bank. "We might just make it, old friend," he said softly. Buddy nudged his hand, tail wagging, eyes bright as embers. The warehouse no longer seemed like a tomb. It was a forge waiting to burn again. Walter turned toward it, shoulders squared against the cold. "Come on, Buddy. Let's see what else your nose can find." The dog bounded ahead, eager, while behind them, The hatch exhaled its mist into the morning air, as though the earth itself had decided to keep their secret, for now. Snow fell in slow, exhausted spirals over Boise, the kind that didn't rage, but simply endured. By the third week, the city was more white than gray, more memory than place. The warehouse, once a carcass of splintered beams and rust, now stood like a stubborn heartbeat against the winter. Walter Miller, sleeves rolled up over scarred forearms, worked methodically under the weak light of a makeshift lantern. The 72-year-old man moved with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime coaxing broken engines back to life. His back ached, his breath fogged, yet in his eyes burned that quiet, relentless spark that no storm could extinguish. Every screw, every plank, every line of pipe he fitted back into place seemed to stitch the pieces of his own soul together. Beside him, Buddy, his 9-year-old German shepherd, watched with the grave attentiveness of an old soldier. His fur, thick and slightly dulled by age, glimmered under the yellow glow. His eyes, amber flecked with green, tracked every motion, as if memorizing the rhythm of rebuilding. Buddy had once been restless, a creature of perpetual vigilance, but since finding the geothermal vein, something had softened in him. His gait was stronger, his coat had regained its sheen, and there was an almost priest-like calm in the way he surveyed the space, as if he understood that this place was no longer a ruin, but a kind of resurrection. Walter wiped sweat and dust from his brow, gazing around at what they'd built. The collapsed wall had been reinforced with salvaged planks, the holes in the roof now patched with corrugated steel sheets scavenged from old freight cars. He'd even managed to mount 3 solar panels, half broken, half miraculous, that powered a heater and a few lamps. The air inside the warehouse carried the faint metallic scent of old rails mixed with the mineral tang from the warm water below. "Not bad for 2 strays," he murmured, rubbing his hands together. Buddy wagged his tail once, approvingly. Walter had rigged a gravity-fed system that brought water from the geothermal tunnel to a pair of steel tubs he'd installed near the back wall. Steam rose gently from the surface, fogging the air. The warmth carried a hum that felt alive, almost sacred. He'd long since stopped trying to explain it. Whatever science lived beneath the mountain was too kind to be coincidence. Each time he soaked his aching hands, the pain dissolved like salt in a tide. It wasn't youth returning. No, he could still feel the weight of his years. But it was something better. Forgiveness. Word of that forgiveness had begun to travel, slipping through town like smoke through cracks. At first it was whispers in the Rail Yard Cafe, a little brick shop run by Martha Dean, a plump woman in her 50s with auburn hair always tied in a bun and a voice like warm syrup. Martha had known Walter for years, back when he still fixed her delivery trucks. She had a motherly way of talking that could turn an insult into a prayer. When she saw him come in for coffee one morning, coat dusted with snow and eyes clearer than she'd ever seen, she said, "Walter Miller, you look like a man who's been talking to angels." He only smiled and told her about some warm water and good luck. By the end of the week, 2 men from her cafe had shown up at the warehouse, shivering and hopeful. The first was Tommy Reed, a 50-year-old freight worker with a shoulder that hadn't moved right since the accident last spring. He was tall and lean, his face leathery, his smile lopsided from an old nerve injury. The second was Earl Jennings, a mail carrier in his 60s, short, round-bellied, with a wheezing laugh and a cough that rattled his chest like loose bolts. They stood in the doorway uncertainly, hats in hand, watching Walter stir a pot of canned soup. Don't suppose you're still fixing folks like you fix machines? Tommy asked, half joking, half desperate. Walter studied them a long moment. He had known that kind of look before, the one that came when a person had run out of doctors, pills, and hope. "There's warm water out back," he said simply. "Won't promise you miracles, but it's clean and it's kind." Buddy stepped forward then, tail wagging slightly, nose twitching. He circled Tommy first, sniffing near the injured shoulder, then looked back at Walter and gave a short bark. Walter chuckled softly. "He's the doctor now. I just carry his tools." They followed Buddy to the tubs. Steam curled around them as the men rolled up their sleeves. When Tommy dipped his arm, he hissed, then sighed, the kind of sound that comes when pain loosens its grip. Earl sat beside him, soaking his legs, closing his eyes as the heat climbed into his lungs. For half an hour there was no talking, only breathing, water, and the quiet padding of Buddy moving between them. When they left, Tommy flexed his shoulder and laughed for the first time in months. Earl's cough had softened, the rattle replaced by steady breath. "You should charge for this," Earl said. "You're sittin' on a gold mine." Walter shook his head. "Gold don't heal people. It just changes who owes who." Over the next week, more came, always quietly, always through word of mouth. A widow with arthritis in her hands. A veteran whose nightmares had stopped him from sleeping. A young man with asthma. Each was different, but Buddy seemed to know before Walter did which tub they should use. Sometimes he'd nudge a person toward the left one, sometimes the right, as if the water itself whispered through him. When Walter asked him once, half teasing, "How do you know, boy?" Buddy only wagged his tail and stared into the steam as if reading scripture. By the third week, Walter's solitude was gone, replaced by the hum of life. People came to soak, to talk, to leave jars of food or tools in thanks. The warehouse smelled of wood smoke and bread. A string of lights hung across the rafters, Earl's donation. And in the evenings, when everyone had gone, Walter would sit by the tubs with Buddy at his feet, watching the reflection of the lanterns tremble on the water's surface. He would think about the life he'd lost, the factory job, the family dinners, the house with the broken porch swing, and realize he didn't miss any of it. Here, amid rust and ruin, he'd found something cleaner than comfort. Purpose. But sometimes, when the wind wailed outside, a part of him still feared it would all vanish. The warmth, the people, the quiet sense of belonging. He'd seen how good things got taken once they were noticed. The world didn't trust miracles unless they could sell them. That night, he ran a hand through Buddy's fur and whispered, "If they ever come for this, you lead us somewhere else. Promise me." The dog pressed his muzzle against Walter's arm in answer, eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. Outside, the snow continued to fall, slow and unending. Yet within the warehouse, the air shimmered faintly with heat, with breath, with faith. It was no longer a ruin. It was a sanctuary, born from the hands of a mechanic and the heart of a dog. The sky above Boise that evening was a strange color. Not the clean white of snow, nor the dark blue of an honest storm, but something bruised and trembling, like the skin of a thundercloud about to split. The wind howled through the broken ridges, dragging the scent of thaw and metal across the valley. By dusk, the temperature plummeted and rain began to fall, freezing before it hit the ground. The warehouse, Walter Miller's stubborn fortress of scrap and hope, groaned under the assault, each drop turning to ice before sliding off the patched tin roof. Walter, 72 and carved from the same steel he worked with all his life, stood in the doorway, a hand braced against the frame, watching the world collapse into gray. His face, deeply lined and weather-beaten, reflected both exhaustion and defiance. He had that look of men who have already lost everything once, calm, unflinching, almost fatalistic. Behind him, Buddy, the German shepherd who had become more myth than dog in the eyes of the small community, paced restlessly. His fur, streaked with silver from age, bristled with unease. The old shepherd was no longer the playful creature of Walter's better years. He was a sentinel now, steady, intuitive, and strangely perceptive of the invisible dangers the earth whispered. He gave a low growl, head turning toward the south wall where the sound of water echoed faintly through the ground. Walter heard it too, a deep, steady rumble that did not belong to wind. "Not tonight," Walter muttered, pulling on his thick, oil-stained coat. His joints protested as he moved, the pain sharp in his chest and knees, but he ignored it. He grabbed the flashlight, its beam cutting through the swirling frost, and stepped outside. The ground was slick, the snow turning to slush as rivulets of meltwater began to snake through the rail yard. Buddy bounded ahead, barking sharply, not panicked, but insistent, the way he always did when something demanded attention. The storm had turned unpredictable, a freak microburst, as the local weatherman had called it on the radio that morning. The mix of snow and rain was creating flash floods across the lower valley. Walter trudged toward the far side of the warehouse, where he'd installed the solar array and battery station, his lifeline to light and heat. The slope behind the building was already slick with water, the frozen ground unable to absorb the runoff. The stream was rising fast, a silver vein under the storm's dim pulse. Buddy barked again, running ahead to the first weak spot, a sandbag wall they'd built weeks ago to divert runoff. Walter followed, heart hammering, his breath fogging the air. "I see it, boy. I see it," he shouted over the wind. He dropped to his knees and began reinforcing the barrier, his fingers clumsy from cold. The dog darted back and forth, barking at specific points, first near the solar frame, then at the water tanks, then at the small medical shed where Walter kept supplies for the neighbors who came to soak in the hot springs. Each bark was precise, directional, urgent. "All right, Sergeant," Walter grunted, his old soldier instincts returning. "You call it, I'll follow." He could feel his pulse hammering too hard, the old ache in his chest tightening. He had once been drafted in the late 60s, sent to fix engines in a war he never believed in, but nights like this brought that familiar clarity, the sense of purpose in disaster. He tied down the loose cables, hauled the heavy batteries onto the higher pallets, and stacked scrap metal as barricades where Buddy guided him. The storm roared louder, a mix of rain and sleet that bit like knives. Hours passed in fragments. A flash of lightning, a bark, the clang of metal, the taste of blood from his cracked lips. He didn't know when the world had gone fully dark. All that remained was the rhythm of the work, and Buddy's voice cutting through the chaos like a metronome of survival. When the final wave hit, bursting over the sandbags and flooding the lower half of the yard, Walter was already soaked to the bone, his hands numb, but the panels held. The warehouse shuddered but did not give. By the time he stumbled back inside, his clothes clung to him like ice. Buddy shook himself dry near the stove, sending droplets across the floor. Walter sank into his chair, chest heaving. He reached for the drawer beside his bed and froze. The small orange bottle of heart medication lay empty. He had known it was running low, but hadn't dared admit it. "Well," he rasped, "guess it's just you and me again, boy." Buddy whined, pacing. Then, with an almost deliberate motion, the dog disappeared toward the rear room, the one where the breath spring, as Walter had called it, flowed into the secondary tub. Minutes later, Buddy returned, jaws clenched gently around an old glass bottle filled with the steaming mineral water. He set it down beside Walter's chair, then looked up expectantly. Walter laughed weakly, the sound half cough. "You think I should drink it, huh?" His hand trembled as he lifted the bottle. The warmth radiated through the glass. He hesitated, part superstition, part fear of believing in miracles. "Can't believe I'm taking medical advice from a dog." He took a sip. The water was earthy, metallic, carrying the faint sweetness of something ancient. As it slid down, he felt a slow warmth spread through his chest, easing the tightness. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing. The warehouse creaked, the water level rose against the sandbags, and lightning danced beyond the ridge. But inside, the flicker of the stove light and the sound of Buddy's steady breathing filled the silence. It was around midnight when the volunteers arrived. 2 local paramedics who had been caught in the flood while checking rural routes. The first was Elena Price, a woman in her late 30s, short and sharp-featured, with dark, curly hair plastered to her forehead. Her uniform was soaked, her lips blue from the cold, but her eyes held that unshakable calm of people who had seen too much suffering to panic anymore. The other, Marcus Doyle, was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a trimmed beard and a quiet voice. He'd once worked as a firefighter before a back injury pushed him into ambulance duty. The storm had trapped them near the rail line, and the faint light from Walter's window had been their only beacon. When they burst in, they found Walter pale but conscious, Buddy sitting sentinel beside him. Elena rushed over, pressing fingers to his wrist. "Sir, you're in cardiac distress," she said quickly. "Where's your medication?" "Gone," Walter rasped. "Dr. Buddy here's been filling in." He gestured weakly toward the bottle. Marcus frowned, touching the glass. It was still warm. "What is this?" Walter explained in fragments. The geothermal spring, the healing effect, the experiments with the water. They exchanged a look of disbelief. Elena checked his pulse again and blinked. "It's stabilizing." She watched the old man's chest rise more evenly, color returning to his lips. "Whatever that is, it's working." The 3 of them sat in stunned silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of rain. Buddy shifted closer to Walter, resting his head on the old man's knee. The dog's breathing synced with his master's, slow and deliberate, as if tethering him to the world. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind frozen rivulets of silver under the first blush of sunrise. The warehouse still stood. The panels were intact. Walter slept soundly for the first time in years, his pulse steady beneath Elena's fingers. She looked at Marcus, shaking her head with quiet awe. "You ever seen anything like that?" Marcus glanced at the dog, whose eyes were open, glowing faintly in the firelight. "Not in this world," he murmured. And in the corner, where the last of the water pooled before freezing solid, the faint shimmer of heat rose, the breath of the earth still alive, as if keeping its promise to those who believed. Morning came like a slow confession. The storm had passed, leaving Boise wrapped in an eerie calm. The snow was no longer pure white but streaked with ash and silt, the scars of the night's fury etched across the valley. The warehouse stood, dented, flooded in parts, yet alive. Its patched roof steamed under the weak sun, releasing breath like a living creature that had survived something it shouldn't have. Inside, Walter Miller stirred awake on his cot, the ache in his bones deep but not unkind. His heart still beat steady, a quiet rhythm against the hum of thawing pipes. Across from him, Buddy, the aging German shepherd, sat upright near the door, tail flicking lightly, eyes fixed on the sunlight that crept across the floor. His fur was matted from the storm, his right paw bandaged from a gash he'd earned dragging an old crate to safety. Yet his gaze held the same fierce clarity, the kind that said, "The job isn't done." Walter exhaled, rubbing his face. "You're a better man than me, Buddy," he muttered. The dog tilted his head, ears twitching, then huffed. That soft, impatient sound he made when his humans spoke nonsense. They weren't alone. In the far corner, Elena Price and Marcus Doyle, the paramedics from the night before, were organizing supplies. Elena, her dark curls now tied back in a bandana, had shed her soaked uniform for a flannel shirt too big for her frame. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, but her sharp brown eyes softened whenever they glanced toward Walter. Marcus, broad and quiet, was patching the generator cables, his jaw set in that unspoken way men have when fixing things becomes a form of prayer. He had a faint limp, an old injury, he'd mentioned, from a house fire in Uho 9 that cost him his partner and left a scar on his calf like melted wax. Walter sat up slowly, his chest tight but steady. "You two didn't have to stay." Elena gave a short laugh. "Storm washed out every road. We're stuck here till the county plows remember this place exists." She looked around at the warehouse, the tubs, the quiet hum of the geothermal pump. "Besides," she added, "I think the world might need to hear what's happening here." Marcus nodded silently, tightening a bolt. "She's right. People die waiting for things they can't afford. Whatever this spring is, it's not just luck." Walter frowned. He didn't like words like miracle or discovery. They attracted the wrong kind of people: investors, thieves, bureaucrats. He'd seen what happened when something pure met paperwork. "It's just water," he said softly. "Kind water. That's all." Buddy barked once, as if disagreeing. By afternoon, the storm's destruction became clear. Roads were blocked, power lines down, and the news broadcast from Marcus's radio spoke of rural clinics flooded beyond use. And then, inevitably, they came. One car, then another. Locals. People from the valley. Not tourists chasing stories, but the ones life had left behind. The sick, the forgotten, the weary. The first was a middle-aged woman named Irene Calloway, thin as a winter reed, her skin waxy and pale from kidney failure. Her teenage son, Nathan, drove her there after hearing whispers from a friend who worked with Marcus. Nathan was 17, his face still caught between boy and man, with shaggy blonde hair and a look of exhaustion too old for his years. Walter recognized that look, the silent desperation of someone trying to save what the world had already given up on. Walter watched as Buddy approached the pair, nose twitching. The dog circled Irene once, then padded toward the tub near the west wall, the one Walter called the heart spring. He barked twice and looked back expectantly. Nathan hesitated. "Is he saying she should—" "Yeah," Walter said. "That's his way." They helped Irene into the tub. Steam rose around her fragile frame. Her breathing was shallow at first, then steadied. Color returned to her face, faint but undeniable. Tears ran down Nathan's cheeks as he gripped her hand. By evening, 2 more arrived. A veteran with nerve damage, a woman with chronic asthma. Elena and Marcus moved like medics in a field hospital, documenting vitals, writing everything down. "If we're going to prove this," Elena said, her voice trembling with something between science and faith, "we need records, data. The world ignores miracles until you quantify them." Walter only half listened. He was outside, checking the solar rig, watching the crowd grow. 3 cars, then 5. People brought what they could. Jars of honey, blankets, old canned goods. They didn't come for profit or spectacle. They came because word had spread that in a forgotten rail yard, an old man and his dog had found a way to make the earth heal again. That night, as the temperature dropped, Walter gathered everyone inside the warehouse. The walls glowed with the soft light of lanterns, and the scent of mineral water filled the air. "This place," he began, "was never meant to be a business. If you're here, you give something back. Not money, but time, work, care. Help keep the fire burning." He gestured toward the tubs, where the steam rose like incense. "We'll keep it simple. No one takes more than they need. No one's turned away, and no one sells what isn't theirs." The crowd nodded, murmuring assent. Buddy barked once, sealing the vow like a priest giving benediction. In the days that followed, the warehouse transformed. Walter built benches from old planks. Marcus rewired the lighting to run efficiently off the solar array. Elena created a logbook of every visitor and their ailment, each one signed and dated. "The Boise Ledger of Healing," she called it, half joking. People began to come not just for relief, but to help. Irene, recovering strength, cleaned the floors. Nathan, with steady hands and quiet gratitude, learned to maintain the pipes under Walter's guidance. Buddy, ever watchful, became the silent conductor of this new order. He patrolled the perimeter at dawn, greeted arrivals with a calm, measured look, and somehow always knew which spring suited which person. Children adored him. Old men swore he could read thoughts. And though Walter laughed it off, deep down he sometimes believed it too. One morning near the end of winter, when frost still clung to the rails but the sun had returned to the sky, Buddy began barking near the entrance. Walter opened the door, expecting another visitor, and froze. There, sitting in the snow, was a small German shepherd pup. No more than 4 months old, its fur a soft mixture of sable and cream. Its eyes were wide, curious, and unafraid. It looked at Buddy, the old sentinel, with a gaze both questioning and reverent, as though recognizing something older than memory. Buddy approached slowly, sniffing, then sat down beside the pup. For a long time they stayed like that, 2 silhouettes against the snow, old and new, past and future. Walter stood there, hands in his coat pockets, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like the line continues." Behind him, the warehouse hummed with the sounds of life, laughter, steam, footsteps, stories. The sanctuary had become what neither science nor prayer alone could build, a home for the broken that kept on healing itself. As dusk fell, Walter lit a lantern and placed it on the windowsill. "If being abandoned was the beginning," he murmured, "then loyalty, yours, mine, his, that's the ending worth living for." Outside, the pup barked softly, and the light of the lantern flickered, not from the wind, but as though the flame itself bowed to the truth of those words. In the quiet after the storm, when the snow turned to silver dust and the last lantern still flickered in Walter's window, something sacred remained. Not in the water itself, but in what it awakened. Some called it geothermal science. Others whispered it was grace. But Walter knew better. Miracles were never about the heat of the earth. They were about the warmth still left in the human heart. Buddy didn't just guide the sick. He reminded them to believe again. Every healed wound, every steady heartbeat, every tear that fell into that steaming spring was a reminder that faith has no formula. It flows quietly, like water beneath the frozen ground, waiting for those willing to dig deep enough to find it. And maybe, just maybe, that's how God works. Not through thunder or spectacle, but through small mercies, an old man's second chance, a loyal dog's devotion, a stranger's kindness. If you're listening to this now, remember, the same warmth runs under your life too. Beneath the noise, beneath the fear, there's still a spring waiting to rise. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Not just online, but with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Let's see how far faith can travel. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories of love, loyalty, and redemption. And may God bless every soul who still believes that miracles, big or small, are never lost. They're just waiting to be found.